to our text in Daniel 7. In verse 5, it describes the second beast, and it describes it like a bear. And it says the bear was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So, what would be the modern day nation whose symbol is a bear? It's Russia, the Russian bear. So Russia is represented by the bear, okay? And we know that it is, quote unquote, raised up on one side because 75% of Russia's population is on the western side of that nation, and not just the western half. Really, you can see from this map, this density map, that it is predominantly the far west third, if not a quarter of the nation. So if you were to picture the weight of the population, right, it is going to be, quote unquote, lifted up on one side because it is not naturally or evenly distributed across the full landmass that is known as Russia. It is more densely populated in the west. So that one, Russia being symbolized by a bear, check. It being raised up on one side where it's dominant on its west side, check. And in fact, if you were to look at another map, as far as watching for where Moscow is and Jerusalem, Moscow is almost due north from Jerusalem. So that's also interesting that this bear, okay, that it is raised up on the side that is due north of Israel. What about the 3 ribs? There's debate about what the 3 ribs represent. In the Old Testament, a rib is symbolic of a structural side to either a human being, like our rib cage, or to an object. There are verses that describe the ribs of the altar. So we know that the Old Testament symbology is going to think of a rib as a structural side or something to the side or on the side. When I looked into the history of Russia, one thing I found was its growth being in stages where it slowly devoured its neighboring countries. So it went after 3 ribs, which would be historically the nations that it conquered in order to establish itself as an empire. But you can also look at it in modern terms if you're still thinking neighboring countries, because I don't know if it is describing it as having 3 ribs in the past when it was still a substantial empire, or if it has the 3 ribs in its mouth at the end of days or in the end times at the time that the 4th beast rises up. If it is in modern times and we are talking neighboring countries, what's really interesting is if you look at the neighboring countries around Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan both have alliances with Russia. So even though Russia hasn't, quote unquote, conquered them and absorbed them into that nation, it is holding those 2 ribs in its mouth. So it depends on what that visual means, right? Is it devouring it? Is it holding it? Has it absorbed it into itself? So if it is about conquering and devouring and absorbing it into itself, it may be a historical reference to the neighboring countries that historically it absorbed. But if we're talking modern times, right now, Belarus and Kazakhstan have an alliance with Russia. Look at how Ukraine is one of the other possible ribs. And we know that there is an issue between Russia and Ukraine that has not been resolved. We're not sure when it's going to be resolved. Ukraine may end up being a 3rd rib in Russia's mouth. We don't know. But if you look more toward the south, the countries that separate Russia from Israel would include Georgia or Azerbaijan. So, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. So it's possible that maybe the country of Georgia might end up being that 3rd rib. We don't know. So there's a lot of debate about what the 3 ribs are and whether it's historical or whether it's modern. So I've also heard people talk about how they think that the three ribs could be China, Iran, and Syria, because we know that Russia has, I don't know if they have official alliances with all three countries, but we know that they definitely work together and have a relationship with each other. They also tend to be the nations that threaten Israel the most and the most forcefully and the most consistently. So we also look at the threat that they pose to the entire world. So China, Iran, and Syria, that's another one that gets tossed out as possibly the three ribs in the bear's mouth. Another idea I came across was that Russia actually had three different governments during the time that it was considered an empire. So Russian Empire was 1721 to 1917. Then for 5 years after that was Soviet Russia, and then it became the Soviet Union, and it was the Soviet Union from 1922 until 1991. Fast forward to 1999 is when Putin came into power, and he continues to be in power today. So the Russia of today is ran and controlled by Putin. So it's also possible the three ribs in the mouth could be the three previous governments that had been conquered or aren't in existence anymore. I tend to lean toward the ribs being neighboring countries because, as we're going to see in the third beast, I believe that if it was governments, it would be represented by heads and not by ribs. So when we start looking at the symbolism, a head in the Old Testament tends to represent a nation, a ruler, a king of some sort, whereas, like I said, ribs would be a structural side, something on the side, something that holds something together, holds something in. So I tend to lean toward the bear being Russia and either the ribs being historical growth and expansion into kind of the rise and fall of Russia as an empire, or it could be something to watch for in the news about what's going to happen between Russia and Ukraine, and could Ukraine be the third rib of modern times, or could it be Georgia or something like that? And again, it could be both, because we could also be looking at layers as far as watching for patterns and watching for these things that are happening historically that would relate to the prophet.